The approach that we've developed builds on the 2003 UN Common Understanding of a Human Rights-Based Approach, which articulated a number of elements that we've consolidated into 4 key elements. These reflect essential principles of international human rights law and principles of good governance more generally. At the very top is the principle of non-discrimination and equality. This idea is reflected in the Sustainable Development Goals by the idea of leaving no one behind. But within an international human rights perspective, that idea is transformed into notions about both positive and negative duties of the responsible actors at the state level. So there's an important need for states to both refrain from taking certain measures that have an adverse impact on different groups, so avoiding discrimination on grounds of race or religion or gender or disability, but also there's a positive duty on the state to take steps to the maximum of available resources in order to help different groups within society to achieve the full realization of human rights, including in situations of disasters and climate change. So it's built on that recognition that people have different starting points and states need to take positive measures to facilitate the realization of rights in these different contexts. And within this element of the human rights-based approach, we find that cross-cutting intersectional gender equality aspect. So recognizing that people are different and have different preconditions for the realization of human rights according to different characteristics like gender, age, disability, immigration status, and so forth. And that these categories are not isolated from one another, but intersect. So persons with disabilities in an irregular migration situation will have particular exposure and vulnerability to disaster-related harm, including in the context of displacement, that need to be taken into account. And it's important that we develop practical measures to think about how to address those particular circumstances in different kinds of contexts. A second element is the governance systems and structures that underpin disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and sustainable development initiatives. Do these legal and policy frameworks expressly adopt a human rights-based approach? Do they, for instance, provide measures for appealing against decisions to move informal settlements out of exposed and vulnerable areas? What happens when people suffer from rights violations in evacuation centers where people face an increased risk of exposure to gender-related violence? What kind of systems and support structures are in place to prevent foreseeable harm in that kind of context? And what kind of measures are available in the aftermath of different kinds of violations in that context? What kinds of plans, how are the roles and responsibilities of different actors in a multi-level governance perspective articulated in these legal and policy frameworks? And importantly, this element emphasizes the need to go beyond the paper to inquire into the implementation of these frameworks. So do the local level actors know what their responsibilities are under national legal and policy frameworks, as well as in relation to international standards and guidelines? But crucially, it's not only about knowing what the law requires, but also having the means to implement those legal obligations, including by having adequate budgetary allocation, as well as capacity strengthening at different levels and accommodating different kinds of circumstances that are faced by different actors at subnational and local levels. So that governance element really emphasizes a comprehensive rights-based framework that doesn't operate in silos, but also builds on that Sendai framework ambition of having a multi-level, multi-stakeholder, multi-sectoral approach that is people-centered and geared towards leaving no one behind. A third element of this human rights-based approach is the procedural element. And this builds on the idea of active and meaningful participation, which is an essential principle under international human rights standards, but is also a well-established part of development cooperation and sustainable development in general. The well-established slogan, "Nothing about us without us," reiterates the importance of active and meaningful participation of different groups in issues that affect them. So what does that mean in practice? It might mean, for instance, where there's the development of an early warning system, there's a need to engage with organizations of persons with disabilities to help design an appropriate system that addresses the particular situation of persons with sensory disabilities, people who have difficulty reading, people with mobility difficulties, and so on. The need to have that active engagement, not only as part of a consultative process, but also within the decision-making structures that relate to sustainable development, disaster risk reduction, and climate change adaptation. There's also the critical element within this procedural dimension of access to information, which connects to the early warning element that I mentioned earlier, but also the general idea about people needing to know about the risks that they face in the particular locality where they're living or working, and the need, again, to adopt that non-discrimination and equality element to ensure that messages reach different people who have different circumstances, differing literacy, different language, and other kinds of capabilities, taking into account the needs of people living in remote areas, for instance, along with a range of other considerations. Now, the final fourth element of this human rights-based approach we call the substantive element. And here there's a significant contribution made by international human rights law based on the key substantive rights that are articulated in international treaties, like the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, as well as the International Bill of Rights containing the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. These substantive rights spell out what it actually means to have a right to life and what the state's obligations are to respect, protect and fulfill that right. And what does the right to food mean? And what does the right to health mean? And what about the right to water and sanitation? And through the development over decades of monitoring by treaty monitoring bodies, we have a range of international standards and guidelines that articulate in a level of detail that is relevant to national level actors and at times even subnational actors. We get an understanding of what these kinds of rights mean to people even in situations of disasters. And so part of that consolidation of international standards and guidelines that's contained in the background brief spells out what these rights mean in practice. So the substantive element of the human rights-based approach is an essential complement to existing approaches which might mention the need to address food, water, sanitation, health, and other elements familiar to emergency preparedness and response, but by adding substantial depth to what it actually means in this context. And I'll mention again the international standards and guidelines that some participants may already be familiar with. For instance, the SPHERE standards, which are widely implemented in humanitarian contexts, expressly adopt a human rights-based approach and articulate how those substantive rights apply in a disaster setting. Similarly, the Interagency Standing Committee's operational guidelines for the protection of persons in situations of natural disasters also spells out the relevance of these substantive rights in emergency contexts. So those four elements represent a consolidation of the UN's 2003 Common Understanding of a Human Rights-Based Approach, and we've developed it further with reference to the international standards and guidelines that apply in disaster contexts in particular. But it's also worth mentioning that we're at the Institute engaged also in projects that seek to further integrate a gender equality perspective into the human rights-based approach, and we call that approach the Framework for Integrating Rights and Equality. We don't have space to develop that concept substantially in this presentation, but it's important to identify two additional elements which complement the human rights-based approach that I've presented up to this point. And those elements are, firstly, the need to take into account the social context and the social norms that affect how people enjoy rights in particular contexts, and which influence the differential exposure and vulnerability to disaster risk in these kind of contexts. A human rights-based approach focuses in particular on the relationship between individuals and communities with the state, the responsibility of the state to protect people from foreseeable harm is an essential feature of a human rights-based approach, but it doesn't often get to the details of intersocial relationships, which is an important element of a gender equality perspective. So we want to highlight that element also features as part of an integrated rights-based and gender equal approach. And additionally, the importance of focusing on agency and empowerment also adds to the human rights-based approach by articulating the need to move beyond essentializing language about vulnerable groups, which is common in legal and policy frameworks relating to disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation in general, focusing on the agency of individuals and their capabilities, and emphasizing the importance of taking measures to strengthen those capacities. And that connects also importantly with the procedural element about the role of different groups in effective decision-making contexts. So that's a quick summary of the essential four elements of a rights-based approach.